Hi everyone and welcome back to Story of the World Highlights. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 9. Now, Chapter 9 brings us to two different parts. The first part's going to take place in the Indonesian area of the world. And then the second part is going to bring us back to Europe in the Ottoman Empire. So let's get started. To start, we learn about the Dutch East Indies. So this group of islands is known as an archipelago. That's a group of islands, and these ones are where modern-day Indonesia is. Now, at the time, the Dutch, who are from the Netherlands, owned most of the region. They had colonized most of it due to trading interests. The Dutch East India Trading Company, which we've talked about a little bit, was the #1 trading company at the time. And they had a lot of ports for trading in these little islands. And so they had started to, when the government took over the trading company, they also took control of the lands where the ports were. And so that is how those islands became part of the Dutch Empire. Now, they weren't the only people in this area. They were the majority. That's why it was called the Dutch East Indies, but they weren't the only one. Of course, our other big colonizer, Great Britain, was also there. And Great Britain also was there for trade reasons. They also had their big #2 in the world trading company, the British East India Trading Company. Now, both of them had interest in this area and wanted to claim land. And in particular, they wanted to claim this big island known as Sumatra. Now, the problem with Sumatra is that Sumatra is very close to the British land that the British people owned. And that is up here with Singapore in modern-day Malaysia. Now, the British didn't want the Dutch so close to them. And so they had to have a talk about who could have Sumatra. Finally, in 1824, they struck a deal. And in this deal, it said that the Dutch would promise to never attack Singapore. The Dutch would give up the few trading posts that it had in India to Great Britain, so that Great Britain had all control in India. And in return, they could have Sumatra. Well, almost all of Sumatra. See, Sumatra is still, again, really close to the British Empire region. So they had to promise, the Dutch, that they would not try and conquer Aceh. Aceh was the Northern Kingdom area, and that had to stay independent to give a little bit of space between Great Britain and the Dutch. And the Dutch said, deal. They wanted Sumatra. That was most of Sumatra, no problem. So they went in and they took over, and it was great. It was really rich farmland. There were lots of natural resources like rubies and sapphires and gold and coal for steam engines. Great stuff for them. And with this rich farmland, they decided to have some farm rules. So rule #1 was that 1/5 of all the land would end up going to the government, and any crops grown on it would be profited by the government. And rule #2 was that all of these private Dutch farmers there had to work 3 days of the week on these government farms, laboring. Now, those farmers didn't want to work on the government land, and they weren't too happy about it. So the Dutch came up with a new idea. They said, how about the local mayors and chiefs can manage the government land and have their people work on it, and in exchange, the government will give them some of the profits. Now, the landowners, the mayors and chiefs of the local region saw a quick opportunity to make money. And so they exploited a lot of their people. They forced them to work harder than the Dutch were even asking because they wanted that money and income. And so eventually, all of those poor workers on those farms who were being worked to death finally rioted the bad working conditions. And they started to notice, the Dutch, that these riots were being encouraged by the Aceh people next door. And so the Aceh were now starting to get in the way, and the Dutch just really wanted to take it over and have them no longer be a problem. So in 1871, they got permission from Great Britain. They made another agreement. And Great Britain said, okay, fine, you can have Aceh. even though it's not really Great Britain's to give. But anyways, in 1873, they invaded Aceh. However, the Aceh people were not going to just sit there and let their country area be taken. They were going to fight back. And they fought hard. Everyone, man, woman, child, businessman, farmer, they all fought back. And one of the fiercest warriors was this woman named Dien. And Dien and her husband were big guerrilla fighters. Now, guerrilla warfare is the type of warfare where there isn't a battlefield. They're hiding and making sneak attacks. And so this was what was really happening in Aceh during this war, is that the Aceh people were going into the jungle and hiding and sneak attacking. And that was a really good benefit for them because they knew the land really well. Now, her husband had died and she married another fighter, but that didn't stop her. She kept fighting fiercely. She even had a baby and carried her baby into battle. She had a cause that she was not going to give up on. Now, her and her new husband did realize that while they were doing well, they weren't going to ever win unless they had weapons, proper weapons. So they devised a strategy. The strategy was, step 1, pretend to surrender to the Dutch. They went in and they waved their little white flag, which is a symbol of peace. And they said, okay, we're surrendering. We give up. We're all yours. And the Dutch were like, okay. And they let them be part of the Dutch army. And they, step 2, convinced other Aceh people to join and surrender. And with that, they finally had enough Aceh people to have a small little group of soldiers. And they loaded up those soldiers with weapons, step 3. And then Dien's husband led his troop of Aceh soldiers and their weapons off to battle. But they never came back because they just went back to their side with all those weapons. Sneaky plan. It worked. Her husband did eventually die in battle. And in 1901, 30 years after the fighting had began, we saw the Dutch capture Dien, unfortunately. They didn't kill her, but they sent her very far away to live under guard until she died of old age. She was then known as the queen to the people of Aceh because she was their fiercest warrior. In 1903, just 2 years later, the Dutch finally took control of Aceh, but was it really a win? Because through all this fighting, they had spent all profit they had ever earned in the Dutch East Indies. So they won, but at what cost? That was the end of the first part of chapter 9, but we're going to be moving on now into the second part. And the second part was about the sick man of Europe. The sick man of Europe was the Ottoman Empire. Now, they were called this for many reasons, but primarily because they owed a lot of money to other countries in Europe and around the world. And number 2 is that, remember, it was a vast country, and we learned that when your country is so big, it's actually harder to control. And that was what was happening for the Ottomans. A lot of their areas in their empire, they were losing control of. So with that, Russia, Tsar Nicholas I, yes, the one you read about in chapter 2, he saw an opportunity to strike again. For you see, he had not given up his dream of taking Istanbul. So in 1876, he saw his opportunity. In 1876, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was Abdul Aziz. And Abdul Aziz, while a nice, jolly man, he unfortunately had a problem with Bulgaria. And in Bulgaria, a lot of people, just like in Italy, were starting to rebel and want independence for their country. They made their own little rebel groups, like Young Italy, to try and revolt against the control of the Ottoman Empire. Now, unfortunately, Aziz made a really bad decision. He just decided to solve the problem, he was just going to kill everyone. Just kill them all. Be done with the problem. and he wiped out 60 villages. 60 villages of men, women, and children, innocent people who weren't even rebels. And this action caused Europe to be just horrified. They were like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. How could you? Innocent people, human rights, all of that. And even other Turks within the empire could not believe that their leader had done such a thing. So in the middle of the night, he was murdered by his own people. When he died, his nephew Murad V became sultan, but Murad V was a little bit of a scaredy cat and easily fainted and just wasn't meant to be a leader. So he was sent far, far away to go and rest or whatever. And his brother, Abdul Hamid II, became sultan. Now, Abdul Hamid really knew that he had inherited a very bad situation. There was no money, there was rebellion, Europe hated the Ottoman Empire. But he worked his hardest to try and make it better. He adopted Western styles, he made a constitution, he created an assembly, and people in Europe really praised him. But you see, Russia saw that they were weak, and Russia was ready to strike. Here's how Russia went about it. Russia said, listen, guys, listen. The Bulgarian attacks, they were done by Muslim Turks. The Bulgarians killed were Christians. We are Christians in Russia. It is our duty as Christians to go and protect our fellow believers and revenge them. So he went and attacked the Ottoman Empire. And the Bulgarians, who were still mad about the attacks, joined the Russians. And in January of 1878, the Ottoman forces began to crumble. In March 1878, Russia won, and Abdul Hamid was forced to give Bulgaria its independence. But that wasn't all. Russia took part of Anatolia, also known as Asia Minor, for itself. And the Ottomans lost over half of their lands in total. This is why the Ottoman Empire would never again become a major power in the world. That's it for Chapter 9. I'll see you next time for Story of the World Highlights. Bye-bye.